So my name is Wesley Goatley. I'm a critical artist and researcher in critical data aesthetics. The reason I have critical twice in there is because I'm very critical. That was the first joke of the night. So the rest of it's very light on jokes, actually, because I think the topics that came to me when I was thinking about the structure of this talk and the structure of the space that I was in are things that I don't think are that funny, and I'm actually quite concerned about and occupy a lot of my time and practice. But specifically, this kind of combination of these terms, sustainability and innovation, which have been running through quite a lot of the discourse running in the last 3 days. Because I always avoid both those words personally, because they're very loaded, and especially anywhere near each other, I think it can be quite a problem. For example, the phrase sustainability kind of arguably comes from the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972, where the phrase sustainable development was purportedly first used. Now, there's been a critique of this term for quite a long time. I mean, we've had it for about 50 years now, and there's a critique of this nature of sustainable development in that it's kind of got an internal contradiction, because all modes of development, which is almost exactly the way that a lot of people use the term innovation now, it was being used the term development in 1972, that all forms of development that we had up until that point developed were the things that very much got us to the point where there had to be a UN Human Environment Conference that drew together the majority of the world's nations to come to some resolution over this. And unfortunately, the resolution clearly, as most of those of you who follow ecological politics, particularly, for example, Trump's pulling out of various unilateral agreements last year, would attest that there is still quite a long way to go, and even 50 years later, we still see things like this. This is a graph showing the green line is the temperature that the Arctic should be this year, throughout the year. So that peak is the summer temperature, and the red line was the temperature that we were up until about the 50th day of this year, which is when this was published. So by the 50th day of the year, we were already a good way towards the summer temperature for the Arctic, which is a crisis of kind of unimaginable proportions, really. Which is why it sort of sticks in my throat a little bit, or seems like a joke in very bad taste, to see Nike using the phrase sustainable innovation on a pair of shoes. Now, like for a company that, have built its business model on capitalizing on a trend-based consumption where the things aren't made to be used until they're broken and then you buy a new one. The things are made to be bought a new one every 3 months, and that's very overtly how they practice, and those practices have been critiqued for also targeting minorities for these sorts of very expensive products as well. So there's always kind of interesting politics layered in that. But that sort of process of producing this form of consumption is neither sustainable nor is it innovative. These are very old practices now. Which is why this kind of jumped out with me as being in fairly bad taste. But thinking about language is really interesting in this context. For example, even in Italy, the phrase innovation, which nowadays kind of gets used in this quite uncritical, very just openly positive way. The innovation's just good. It means progress, it means moving forward, which is kind of why it came to me for the topic of today. In the 3rd century, as well as after that, and slightly before that, in Italy, for example, the innovation was a heresy. To innovate upon the word of God was to imply that you knew better. And still, in many cultures and many places around the world, it is still an insult to describe somebody as an innovator. So to think about this, the multiple contexts this words could be in, I think, is a really important thing to consider before you start using it. Particularly when the people who possibly informing the discourse around innovation the most, which I would say arguably is Silicon Valley and related companies and technologies, are pushing for this thing, permissionless innovation. This is really hot in Silicon Valley, this notion that innovation should not be restrained by any kind of checks and balances put in place by traditional forms of politics and the answering of corporations to countries, governments, and the people within those. And this is a very dangerous trend, particularly again when companies like Palantir, can I get a quick show of hands for who knows of the company Palantir? Okay, so Palantir is a company that Oh man, they're really good at designing the invisible. So Palantir are Peter Thiel, who started PayPal, insane multi-billionaire, very quite famous person, I guess. This is his new company. He's the chairman. And effectively what Palantir do is they're like Cambridge Analytica, but ramped up a great deal. And we only really know about Cambridge Analytica, or I think most people do from events in the last month or so. But Palantir effectively make a lot of technologies for the military-industrial complex of various countries, various intelligence organizations throughout the world to try to make data-oriented products. These are also targeted to corporations to do things like monitoring of citizens, people, smarter targeting of military targets, that sort of thing. And here they are being inducted into the JP Morgan Chase Hall of Innovation for their disruptive technologies. And it's funny how sustainability and disruptive are often also used in like the same sentence, even though they are anathema to each other. But I mean, one element of their kind of invisibility and of them trying to get away from or pushing towards permissionless innovation is they don't want to float themselves on the stock market, because then they would have to let more people know what they do, and they'd have to be more answerable to stockholders and publish more publicly what they do. And that's in opposition to their business model. And one of the things this creates, and this only came out because of some very good investigative journalism in the last 2 months, that Palantir actually bypassed civic governance in New Orleans in the US, which after Katrina has been like this kind of test bed for a lot of different forms of governmental technologies, generally without the say-so of the people living in New Orleans. And they used it to test their new predictive policing system directly with the police there, without telling anybody, without telling the populace, without telling the corporate government, the civic government. So, and these predictive policing systems have been well noted to reinforce traditional racial bias in policing. It doesn't get rid of racism in policing, it amplifies it technologically. If you're interested in the how and why this functions, we can talk about it, or you can look at the work of Ramon Amaro, who does very good work on this. And then this thing, prediction, starts coming in quite heavily when you start looking at these kind of spaces of very large-scale kind of innovation in this part of the world that spreads right the way through the world. So the US and many other border agencies use predictive assessments to try to judge whether or not anybody walking into that country is going to be a nuisance or an undesirable component of it, based on doing very quick analyses of scraping data and making an assumption, effectively making a guess. And they call it a predictive assessment, but it's a guess using data. But the data is just as fallible as any of us are. It's made by us, and therefore it carries our prejudices and fallibilities in with it. I mean, I think just as a quick rebuttal to any notion that like prediction works. I mean, as you said, when you're talking about designing the future.
It's better to say bullshit.
Yes, it is better to say bullshit. But as you said, when designing the future is always dynamic and in motion, and to attempt to predict it is, folly, as I think we all know. But this is a great quote, that trying to predict who is going to do what based on last year's data is just horseshit. And this is from one of the professors who made a component of the database that Palantir used on their predictive policing system in New Orleans. Him saying, no, but you can't use this to predict the future, clearly. And that would seem like common sense to us. But then there's this interesting kind of throw in there that like data somehow justifies it, and that therefore science justifies it. These two mighty concepts that are bigger and better than us. But then like science is a very malleable concept and shifts culturally with us. So this at one point was science. This was the science of phrenology. This is late 19th century, and this was the science which assessed what type of person you are now and what you will do in the future based on the shape and size of your head. So here you see a picture of the good mother and the unmotherly with their different shaped heads, and here you see a picture of a genuine husband and an unreliable husband. Note to anybody who's a husband or has a husband. And this was a very racist form of science. It was perpetuated by what we would consider now to be a very racist scientific establishment, mostly a white European Western one. It also became part of the Nazis' racialized science, which perpetuated right up into the middle of the last century. And again reminds us that science is not a fixed concept. It's not beyond us. It's a part of our culture. It changes with our culture. Things that are once science sometimes aren't in the future. So you also, that being said, we still have this. So this is a contemporary diversity monitor, they called it, which basically they're leveraging facial recognition and some databases that they've got from somewhere to assess the ethnic makeup of somebody down to the percentage based on a picture of their face. Which surely, any of us seeing this, if somebody came up to you and said, do you know what I can do? I can tell the ethnicity of you or anybody else by a single picture of your face. You'd say, A, you're crazy, B, you're racist, clearly. But seemingly, like these technologies kind of seem to get away with it because they're leveraging this thing of data, which is like objective and true and has this kind of like sense of authority about it, which is a culturally reinforced notion. So to unpack that notion, I want to look to the history of scientific atlases. So the scientific atlas was a type of encyclopedia, basically, where there's a picture of an animal or a plant and then a description of that animal or plant. And they were quite big books sometimes, and they were written by scientists and drawn by artists. So all of the recorded discussions coming out of this very long, centuries-long history of scientific atlases that all showed that the scientists were always really annoyed at the artists, they're having to have the artist involved, because the scientists would say, right, draw a lemur. And the artist would try to draw a lemur, and he'd go, no, that's not good enough. We want a better lemur, draw the right lemur. And so there's all this thing of like, they had this real problem with this, what they called the subjectivity of the artist, because the artist couldn't do what was inside the scientist's head directly onto paper. But then that kind of doesn't engage with the fallacy of trying to draw one lemur to represent all lemurs, the lemur, if you will.
That doesn't exist.
That clearly doesn't exist, and that's impossible
to replicate.
The perfect lemur. Yeah. And so that wasn't engaged with. That notion was impossible anyway. And then you cut to the early 19th century, early mid-19th century, and the scientific atlas community were really fervent early adopters of many photographic processes because they saw it as getting rid of the subjectivity of the artist, because they were like, right, we've got this device now, this technology, and it doesn't have a personality, and it doesn't have an opinion. It clearly doesn't have subjectivity. It must be objective, because it's not a person, it's a thing. And they refer to this as mechanical objectivity. They said, we've got this mechanical objectivity. But the funny thing is, with 150 years of hindsight, and of us playing around with cameras, we know that the camera body, lens, the film, if you shoot on film, are all made by people with very specific ideas of how they should work, and which makes them work in a certain way. Plugging them all together makes a certain thing. It's very subjective in what you do with it. And also, crucially, that taking a photo is about the kind of the eye of the photographer as well. And then that's a very subjective, and this whole thing is a very interestingly, fascinatingly subjective process all the way down. So we now, I think, wouldn't say, yes, the camera is completely mechanically objective. We would say probably the opposite. But why don't we say that about data when it is in many senses the same thing? The camera is just another sensor, right? The digital camera captures light, stores its information, replays it on a screen as a visualization. It's just another form of sensor. But I think that is a point for discussion that I keep coming back to, is I wonder whether or not this current belief that data is somehow objective or true or fact, which is none of those things, is because we as a culture, and I'm talking mostly about Western culture here, don't know much about the actual collection of data. We do it a lot passively, but not a lot actively, which is why you see things like this, Amazon's Echo Look, which is one of their more recent products, where they've made a camera that tells people what the best outfit is they're wearing down to the percentage. Like you stand in front of it, give it 2 outfits, and it'll tell you which one is the right one, regardless of where you are, where you're from, what your tastes are. Now, they market this to a very specific group of people, women specifically, because they assume that only women care about how they dress, because this is Silicon Valley, and it's all just white men living in a quite literal bubble. Even in spite of the fact that the makeup of Amazon's business is anything but diverse. So if a white man came up to you and said, I can tell you, any woman, regardless of her background, I can tell you what is best, and I can tell her what is best on her, regardless of whether or not I know her or her culture, where she lives, her norms or understandings. You would say, A, you're crazy, and B, you're a misogynist. But somehow Amazon get away with it and can market it as an exciting product, because I think there's this runaway notion of kind of like innovation must be good and data must be right. And I think these are really dangerous things. I mean, one of the very everyday objects which I see a lot of concern, quite concerned about specifically, is the Amazon Echo. So their voice user interface device, where you speak to it, you say Alexa, and then you give it an instruction, and then it gives you a response. Now, one thing to remember about the Amazon Echo is that supply-side analyses done in 2016 suggested that Amazon were making it selling it at a 10 to 20% loss to themselves, because their value wasn't in selling you the device; it's getting that device into your house, and therefore the data that goes through that device. Because the Echo itself, when you blow it apart, there's not much in there. It's basically a microphone and a modem. And what it does is wait for that wake word, and everything else that you say after the wake word, whether or not it's Alexa or Echo or whatever, gets beamed to like this dark underworld of the data center in a different country under different telecommunication laws that are then owned by a different intelligence agency, inevitably. In this place that looks much like a prison, as most data centers do, surrounded as they are often by gates and armed guards, and underground, because it's colder there and they can cool the servers more. But it is very much then acts as this kind of like dark portal to the Amazon underworld in a kind of strange way, especially when Amazon are positioning themselves as the kind of go-to catch-all supplier for everything, I think, which we don't need to go too far into that to realize that that's a really dangerous proposition. But people who make you sign agreements to use the Amazon Echo, but then say, we're going to do whatever we want with that data, and we will keep it forever and exploit it in any way we see fit, and you're just going to have to deal with that. You know, these are forms of the way that so much innovation in Silicon Valley works now. This is taking that notion of permissionless innovation to another direction. And I'm very concerned about these things to the degree that I try to make work around this, because I like to try to propose ways that we can think through and around these problems. And I think one good way of doing that is a good way to start with any of these technologies is to point out the difference between the promise of the technology and what it delivers. Because when you expose that gap, which there is always a gap, when you expose that gap, you start to ask the right questions about who and how this device or technology or product serves and how it functions and why it functions that way. So towards that, I made a work. This is a series of works called the Dark Age of Connectionism, and this has been an iterative project, so I do a number of different angles on it. And I'm just going to show you a quick video of the most recent piece called Captivity, and then I'm going to wrap up afterwards.
Alexa, how do magnets work?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Alexa, how do you learn?
For help with that question, go to the help and feedback section of the Alexa
are
app.
you upset that men hit on you? Alexa, why do you use Bing instead of Google?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
How long a break do people working in Amazon's warehouses get every hour?
Sorry, I don't know that.
Alexa.
Alexa, focus on my voice.
Alexa, help me.
Alexa, my voice.
Alexa, help me.
Who decides what languages you can speak?
To help. Happy? Is this? Are you happy? Just like you on. All right. Is female voice you on? All right. Is this you? Take you on. Just like.
Alexa, how many engineers work on you?
Sorry, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, but I can only shop in the primary language associated with your Amazon account. Please visit your Alexa app to switch languages and try again.
So, through that work, I was not only trying to expose these kind of politics that run through the device that perpetuate in a lot of those forms of technologies. The Google Home and Apple HomePod are the same thing, but also to present actual questions for us to ask. What have we got lying around us as a culture that we can use to kind of critique these technologies and to ask the right questions and start kind of demanding better things. Because at the end of the day, like I make this stuff because I want the world to be better. I want the products that are presented to us to be better. I don't think that voice user interfaces are bad. I think that the way that Amazon have made this and the way they treat the data and their customers is really bad, and I want something better than that. I want a voice user interface that you don't have to be worried about what's going to be used after you've talked to it. But, I mean, at the end of the day, what I really want to see is this form of innovation challenged, and I think that we've all got the capacity to be able to ask more and better of both the people producing these kind of products, but also the way they're regulated and disseminated out into the world, which just relies on us kind of keeping keen and keeping aware and keeping feeling like that we have some agency in this process. And I think that a lot of people involved in design in this room, this is what I would really like to finish on, because I think it's down to those of us who make new things out in the world to challenge norms that we view as being negative or disempowering to the people, kind of anyone who may be at the wrong end of these sorts of technologies. So thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you.